This week's episode is sponsored by Panasonic.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Allan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Allan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
And no doubt our audio engineer, Mike Weinstein, will be chiming in with a question or two along the way. How much can you edit a photo before it stops becoming true? That's the question today's guest recently asked in the opening lines of an in-depth story he wrote for CNET. The article, which examines photography in the age of AI and advanced smartphone image processing, reaches beyond the polarizing visual minefield of generative AI by delving into aspects of AI that have been quietly pre-baked into most every camera on the market these days. Photography has always had a complex relationship with objectivity and truth, and the advanced engineering that powers our latest capture devices and processing tools morphs the idea of untouched reality like a shimmering mirage dancing on the distant horizon. I love that line. We have a lot of ground to cover in today's show, so let's dive in and introduce our guest. Stephen Shankland has covered technology, computing, and digital imaging as a principal writer and reporter for CNET since 1998. He's seen it all. He's also a professional photographer who's particularly intrigued by new trends in AI, which makes him an ideal sounding board for our questions today. Stephen stumbled into journalism as a fledgling science reporter covering the Los Alamos National Laboratory. His first and biggest scoop was about radioactive kitty litter discovered in the town dump, which, in addition to making the headlines far and wide, gives us the perfect opportunity to add the word cats and kittens into our conversation, which will no doubt boost our ranking amongst the search engines, at least this week. So, Stephen Shankland, all that said, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I love what you guys do.
Well, that's good to hear. Again, it's going to make the show a lot easier to deal with. Anyway, let's go right into some of the questions we hinted at up front. The introductory sentence to your CNET article, which we quoted in our intro, asks how much a photo can be edited before it stops becoming true. Not stops being true, but becoming true. And that's a very intriguing choice of words. Was there a particular reason why you chose to write becoming rather than being?
Yeah, it was just an intuitive choice, really. I think that a lot of people look at a photograph as this true representation of a scene, but I think in particular, when you start editing a photo, even without some of the advanced AI stuff that's possible, it kind of becomes a journey. It's not just a fixed representation of a particular scene that you happen to see. It's this fluid, dynamic thing that's always changing. So at some point, you might stop editing it, but it's really a constant work in progress.
One of the things I've noticed early on about digital is that I grew up in the day of film, and with film, you press the button and you took the picture, and aside from the processing of it, that was pretty much it. You might burn and dodge, and you could play, if it was color, you could shift color a little bit using filters, but that was pretty much it. When digital came along, I looked at it that when you take the picture, the moment you go click, that is, like you just said, just the very beginning of the life of this image, because again, from there, okay, this is what I have, be it a JPEG or better yet, a RAW file. Where are we going with this?
Yeah, it's funny. I got started in the film era as well, and you're right that I think it was a lot harder to fiddle with a photo in the film era. You had to have a good darkroom, do the developing yourself, but there are other things you could do as well. I saw a recent example. Somebody took a picture of some New Jersey beaches back in the early days of the COVID scare when people were freaked out about being too close. And somebody shot the photo with a really long telephoto lens from a long distance away, and that telephoto foreshortening made it look like everybody was stuffed together side by side on the beach. So, even with purely optical technologies, you can certainly take a perspective, and it's not just sort of pure objective reality in some way. You can always inject some kind of a perspective into your photo, even without digital manipulations. But yeah, you're right. The digital era, things are much more mutable. I shoot RAW, and that gives you a lot more latitude, a lot more headroom, a lot more wiggle room to make the photo look like you want it to look. And so I think for decades now, digital photographers, enthusiasts and pros are, been well aware that you can go a lot beyond that initial capture. I don't think what people appreciate quite so much is just how awful that initial capture is if you don't do something to it. So every camera out there, mirrorless, digital SLR, smartphone, does a lot of basic processing just to get those initial pixels into something that looks reasonable, not merely necessarily super glamorous or exciting or maxed out and eye-popping and cool, but just to get it so it looks usable. You have to do a lot of sharpening and fiddle with color, fiddle with contrast, tone mapping, all kinds of things that happen invisibly inside every camera out there.
No, that's true. We recently had Russell Preston Brown, and we were talking about the differences. In his case, he's just using phones right now, and he uses different phones for different applications. And again, just the way the camera inside that phone interprets the content, the color and the contrast and everything else. And it's no different with cameras because most of the sensors are made by very few companies. They share the basic hardware, and it's how they go in afterwards with the processing and how they're going about it, how much sharpening to do, and all the other adjustments that we get, which determines why some people don't like the color of Canon or Sony or Nikon or prefer one over the other. It's just the way the engineers took all that data and said, here's how we are going to present it.
Yeah, it's kind of a style choice, really, and that's one of the things I really tried to emphasize in that big piece you're referring to on photography in the age of AI. Even without the AI, there's a huge amount of computational processing that goes on to take a photo. So when you take a photo, most cameras just record for each pixel either red or green or blue light data, not all three. And then so one of the first things they have to do is make up 2/3 of the image so that you have red and green and blue values for every pixel. So there's a huge amount of processing that goes on from the moment of shutter release. Now, you talked about phone cameras versus traditional cameras, SLR, mirrorless cameras. Both of those types of cameras use software to process the image, but the camera people are just so far behind the smartphone people. The smartphone people, they start off with these little tiny sensors and not nearly as sophisticated optics on the lens. And they make up for that with a huge amount of processing. So pretty much any modern smartphone these days, when you take a picture, it doesn't just take a single frame. It takes 4 or 8 or up to 15, depending on the camera manufacturer or the phone manufacturer. And then it piles these together and does a whole lot of noise reduction and dynamic range tweaking to actually get you a reasonable photo out of that little tiny sensor. If you're using a traditional camera, it's got a much bigger sensor and it can get away with just a single frame. So that's a little bit closer to the original scene that you saw. But the smartphone processing people, they can do some really clever tricks to get the most image quality out of some pretty limited hardware.
I tell you, speaking firsthand, I recently hung a small show in a local shop, and I have 8 16 by 20s in it. And I had a chuckle to myself because people would come, oh, that's so good. I love you. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, there were 8 pictures. 5 of them were shot with a phone. and the way I processed them, I did raw, and they hold up remarkably well. I was incredibly impressed. But the truth of the matter is, I'm having them side by side with photographs taken with a 40+ megapixel camera and printed properly and presented properly. It's seamless. I hate to say this. Unless you really have a sharp eye and you know what to look for. Because there are certain identifiers of smartphone images that I know I can pick up, but it's real subtle.
Yeah, sometimes you'll see things, depth of field, I think, is often one of the biggest indicators, especially if you're doing portrait photography or something like that.
And forget about sunstars.
Yeah.
It ain't happening.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to get those on your little smartphone. But yeah, you're right that the image quality from smartphones is getting better. I do an annual calendar that I print for my family, 13 by 10-inch photos. And when I started doing this years ago, every single photo was from my DSLR. And now it's about 50-50. And that's a lot because it's a family calendar. They always have people in them. And a lot of what I shoot with my SLR, now mirrorless camera actually, is landscapes and stuff without any people. But when it comes to the family snapshots, I have my phone with me in my pocket all the time. So that's where I take the people pictures. I don't have to run downstairs and grab my real camera. So I'm really glad that the phone camera image quality is getting a lot better. Nobody knows in these calendars I send out which photos were taken with the real camera and which ones were taken with the smartphones, except for me.
I've noticed that I use a Google Pixel phone, and looking at the shots out of the phone in 2023 and 2024 versus like even 5 years ago, the image that I get without any filters turned on, without any tweaking, it's a pretty stylized image. I mean, it's like it's to my eyes, it's slightly oversaturated, there's over contrast, but it is like no matter what you're taking it of, there is some sort of beautification kind of thing going on. I think they've gone a little bit, just in my humble opinion, too far with the software processing on smartphones. Maybe that differs for iOS people.
I would agree 100%. I shoot both with an iPhone and with a Google Pixel phone, and I think they both oversaturate, overprocess, oversharpen, punch up the contrast. And there are a couple qualifiers I have to put in there. So first is I shoot RAW for everything, and so I get to season to taste, and I much prefer that. So when I put these photos in my calendar, it's not the original JPEGs. And then the other caveat is I think I hadn't quite appreciated this earlier in my photography career, but those really punchy, bright images, a lot of people are looking at those on a smartphone as well. And all that processing, it kind of makes my eyes hurt when I'm looking at it on a laptop or a big screen. It's not so obvious on a small screen. It looks a little more normal. And likewise, if I'm editing photos on a small screen on my phone, I think, oh, that looks about right. And then I transfer it up to my laptop and I look at it and I think, oh my God, I just went way overboard. So
Yeah.
and then the other factors, what people actually want,
Right.
beautification filters and nice smooth skin. There are a lot of things that people want in their photos that might not actually be, strictly speaking, true.
I'm just glad that most
Yeah.
people are getting tired and bored of HDR images, because if I see any more landscapes that are just pumped to heck, I don't know what I'm going to do. No, it's true. It was a flavor of the week.
Yeah, they're still using HDR. In fact, probably more than ever. It's just more tasteful. It's just more true to life. But yeah,
Maybe the algorithms figured out what I don't like.
they're listening to your letters that you write in every week. But I think they also, at least with the Google Pixel, it's a composite image. These are multiple images. I can also, as you can probably on the iPhone, pick the best out of 20 or 30. I guess for the man on the street or the woman on the street, it works great because they're looking exactly what you said, Stephen. They're looking for something that looks great, and you don't have to bring into a post-processing piece of software.
I love editing photos, but most people do not.
Exactly.
So taking up on that line, before we start talking about AI, which is, again, it's going to be the 800-pound gorilla today. I'm waiting to talk about it. I want to back up for a second. We were talking about at what point an image stops being true. Now, you also went as far as saying, and I agree with you, that the digital picture, when you go click the picture that comes out, it needs work, no matter how you look at it. What would be the minimal amount of digital editing that you would do that you would consider to be not changing the image, preventing it from being true anymore? How far do you take? And I know at the very least I'll do levels or somewhere along there. I'm just some kind of tonality adjustments, a little bit of maybe the color I'll adjust and sharpening. But at what point is that picture no longer true, or is it a non-issue because the camera itself, as we said, has already pre-digested that image?
That's an excellent question. And a lot of this depends on context. So how much editing is too much? Now, personally, I shoot in different contexts. I shoot my own photos that I like to shoot for my own hobby. And then I also do photojournalism work for my job. And I apply different standards to those. So I tend to be much more of a photojournalist with all of my photography. So I don't generally, remove telephone wires in the background or erase people that distract from a beautiful landscape scene. So that's my personal preference. But for work stuff, I never do anything like that. But yeah, I definitely adjust tone, and I often will boost the brightness of shadows,
Mm-hmm.
and I apply noise reduction to get rid of some of the speckles. So there are, a lot of basic adjustments that I apply, and I don't think they fundamentally are altering the truth of the image. And one rule of thumb I use is, well, did the camera originally capture that data? Yes, and particularly for processing raw photos, what is true and correct about the white balance? Well, if I had my camera set to tungsten light, then it's going to look one way. If I had it set to shade, it's going to look completely different. And so there's some sort of necessary level of interpretation that goes into producing that photo. So I don't feel bad about tweaking those settings like white balance and tone and brightness and exposure. I think that just sort of is the process of a little bit more manual steps to get the right result out of what the camera pixels initially captured. So I don't feel bad about that in photojournalism. And I note that there, some other prickly areas where people are concerned about too much editing. There's photojournalism, crime photography, forensics, photo contests, photos you might send to your insurance company, something like that. There are areas where people want to have some assurance that they're not getting something that's been completely doctored. And in those sorts of situations, I still think, amount of exposure fiddling is fine and justifiable. I think it's interesting that a lot of photo contests are now requiring people who submit entries to include the raw file, and that can be difficult if you're doing lots of compositing and crazy stuff. But I think that that's a good anchor to the truth of what was originally captured.
Yeah, I don't argue with that at all. Although it definitely adds a whole lot of more work into the process for sure. I know I go into contests once in a while if I start sending raw files along. I don't know but if I like the idea of sending raw files out either. It's like sending your negatives to them.
Yeah, I mean, for purposes of validation and checking, I think it's certainly fine. I can see how some people might squirm about it, but I think the more you squirm in a way, maybe you should think about, well, maybe did I overprocess this and take this too far from the truth? If it's something where some measure of truth is to be expected, I think if you look at photo contests, wildlife and stuff, there's a lot of questions about how true that photo is, but also, did you bait the place to attract that hawk or that owl to come flying straight at you so you can get those great eyes popping and stuff? There are lots of squishy areas that even go beyond the raw file. So I think in general, photo trust is something that has to be proved to a certain extent by reputation and personal interactions and things that go well beyond just the ones and zeros in that data file.
Yep. Yep.
In some ways, the counterexamples are interesting. So we've had this technology to create generative images for a couple of years or a year and a half or so. And to my knowledge, the ones that went viral, there was one of Donald Trump being tackled by NYPD. There was a photograph of the Pope in a puffy jacket. There were a couple of others. One had some smoke. A bomb had been reported at the Pentagon. They were so easily dismissed. Would you say that the lack of these, fakes becoming viral and tricking large amounts of the voting public, for instance, is a sign that the fears are perhaps a bit unwarranted?
I think you have to look at the fears today and the fears 2 years from now or 4 years from now. I think that some of the AI manipulations, deepfakes is what you call it when you're creating a fake image of a person or a video. And I think that some of those technologies are sort of convincing at first glance, but sometimes it doesn't take much to realize that's kind of hokey. And, both of those examples you mentioned, the Pope and the Puffy and the Donald Trump arrest sequence of photos, those were generated by generative AI, specifically Midjourney. And both of those were not actually created with the intent to fool people and make them think that this was reality. It was just sort of people creating some provocative images and sharing them. So they weren't packaged as something to get people to rage click or to be terrified of something. So right now, I think there's some different motivations for what has gone viral. What we fear is in the long run that the fakes will get more convincing, that you won't have extra fingers and you won't have, problems where, two separate elements come together in a photo, like two people with their arms around each other or something, that are places where generative AI can really struggle. So if this gets better over the coming years, then it could be more of a problem. I don't think it's been a huge problem today, but I wouldn't discount the technology improving a lot so that it does become more of a problem later. Now, I would add that there are lots of other manipulations that have been going on for years, just regular Photoshop stuff. The thing that's different about the AI is that it makes it easier. It kind of democratizes the process. It's built in as an option to every, Google Pixel phone, or now the Samsung phones, this magic editing stuff you can do. So that's one of the reasons the concern is there. It's not just that manipulations can be done, but that they can be done easily.
As far as manipulations are concerned, I remember it has to be a good 30 years ago was the earliest days of Photoshop. I think it was American Photographer magazine. You guys remember magazines, right? They ran a photograph that somebody produced, and it was, I think it was Reagan and Gorbachev, but Reagan basically was slugging Gorbachev, and Gorbachev is reeling backwards right after the fist hits his cheek, and it was a tight shot. It was very convincing. And they talk about this is Photoshop, this is retouched. But to see that back then, I think most people would automatically question the validity of such an image. Whereas today, we really don't, because we're surrounded by it, and every kid's doing it already.
Yeah, but I was going to make the point that there's another democratization that's happened, which is that everybody in at least the industrialized world has a camera in their pocket.
Yep.
So a picture of an explosion at the Pentagon or anything like that, a notable event with no other sources, is sort of hard to imagine. So I feel like the proliferation of camera phones themselves will be a buttress against manipulation.
I agree. It's not going to be a perfect fix, but I mean, in the era when everybody's carrying smartphones around, we haven't seen this huge uptick in the number of UFO sightings and Bigfoot sightings, things like that. It was perhaps more plausible 50 years ago to, fake a photo and well, maybe you were the only person who happened to have a camera there. Nowadays, if it's something in a big crowd of people, then yeah, there are 100, 1,000, a million cameras there, and it's harder to generate that. Now, I don't think that applies always. If you happen to witness some police atrocity or some gruesome scene in some corner of Ukraine or something, there might not be a ton of people who can corroborate your photos and videos, but certainly that helps in a lot of situations. All of this is gray area. There's nothing here that's going to be, this is disaster, this is the end of the world, or this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's everything here is gray area. There's not going to be something where you can always trust a photo, or you can never trust a photo, or this is all sliders and shades of gray.
I think the UFO conspiracy people have been taken down a peg because there's more cameras than ever and there's less pictures of UFOs than ever.
There's also, you believe what you want to believe. So if you are predisposed to think that some political outrage is being perpetrated when you see a photo of it, you'll believe it whether it's true or not. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that the Earth isn't flat, including photographic evidence, and still plenty of people who believe it is.
Confirmation bias.
Well, that's a touchy subject for me. Let's move on.
Yes, Allan, you want to speak to that?
AI is a big thing these days, according to what I read in the newspapers, and you're pretty busy with this stuff. Can you give us an intro to some of the programs that are out there and which ones you've been using, and how do they differ? To somebody who hasn't started using this stuff or is thinking about it, what are the options?
Are you talking about generative AI specifically?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are three big ones in my universe, and there are quite a few more. The ones that I paid most attention to are Dall-E from OpenAI. That's the company that also produced ChatGPT, which has really helped propel AI and generative AI to the mainstream awareness. There's Adobe Firefly, which is obviously from the top vendor that makes image processing tools, Photoshop and everything else. So Adobe's a big deal. And then there is Google ImageFX, and Google has a lot of AI chops. They've got deep expertise, and a lot of people in the Google orbit, paying customers and things. So those are the sort of the three big ones that I have fooled around with. And I think what one you're going to prefer depends a lot on if you're already lodged in one of those ecosystems. If you're already a paying customer for Chat GPT, then you get Dall-E for free along for the ride. If you are a paying customer for Adobe Creative Cloud, then you get Firefly, and likewise with Google. So if you're one of those people who also wants to be able to do chatbots, then you might get a Google or OpenAI image generation tool along the side for free. If you're not so interested in that or happy with the free versions of those, then I think Adobe is going to look more compelling. And if you're one of those people who already pays for that, then I think that's going to be your natural starting point. I also think the Adobe tools are a little bit better tuned right now for what photographers and digital creators are up to. The other ones are a bit better for ideation and trying things out and fooling around with things, but Adobe Firefly is designed more to be an actual tool. So for example, you can upload your own photo and then do sort of a style transfer to new generative stuff. So you can kind of, keep a more consistent look between, lots of photos. That could be helpful if you're, doing a brochure or something. You want 5 images in it. You want sort of stylistic consistency. So there's some nice tools there. I also like the fact that Adobe explicitly sidesteps a huge amount of the copyright minefield by training mostly with their own data, with all the images that have been uploaded to Adobe stock, plus some public domain stuff that's out of copyright. So if you're using their images to create something, you don't have to worry that somebody's going to come after you and sue you for including some imagery that's not kosher, as opposed to, we've seen other problems like DeviantArt and some of the other, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion having problems getting sued for the training data they're using. That's not going to be a problem with the Adobe stock. So that's some nice reassurance. And also Adobe limits what you're allowed to generate in some ways. So you're not going to be able to generate an image of Donald Trump or the Pope or something like that. So that's sort of a guardrail rather than a feature. But I do think that offers some nice assurances that you're not going to get yourself into trouble as much. I think they all are kind of interesting. I think OpenAI's Dall-E, I think it does a better job with producing exciting images. It really pumps up your prompt. It adds a whole bunch of kind of over-the-top adjectives and stuff in there, which sometimes takes it in a different direction that you want to go, but often produces more dramatic or interesting results. I find the Google one a little bit more nanny state. Nanny state's not the right word, but a little bit more of a minder. Like it wouldn't let me do a zombie. I think that probably violated it. I thought that was too violent. It wouldn't let me use the verb join. Like I was just saying, some subjects joined by some other subjects. It shot that one down. I think, well, some sexual thing. I don't know. It wouldn't,
Right.
It doesn't tell you why it violates their policies, but I think they're still working on that. This is very early days for this. So take what I say with a grain of salt. This is going to look very different a year from now. But for right now, if you're in the digital creation domain, I think Adobe is probably your first starting point.
That's good to hear, because about 3 months ago, I finally stuck more than my toes into the pool and jumped in and started playing around after, again, I was rather intimidated about it and threatened, like many photographers, that this is a threat to what I do. And not only that, but after, feeding zillions of images to all of the social media platforms, we're talking about copyright infringement, even if it's a matter of pixels. So I started playing around with Firefly, and I immediately, to me, it's crack. All right. Once you start, it's really hard to stop. And the first time they say it's free, yeah, okay, you just keep going. It's like I can't sleep at night. Oh, I'm going to play more. But I've been fascinated with it, and I'm using a lot of my own images. I do not use any of their stock. So I've been tapping into my own stock library. I have more than enough topics and subjects and types of images, and using my pictures with prompts and some of their filters. And I'm fascinated by what I'm producing. I recognize my photographs in it, because the texture, color, tones, and shapes of your photograph are reflected or emulated in whatever it is the image you're creating based on your prompts. And I've been having a lot of fun. It's a fascinating thing. And I love the creativity of it. I question how much of it is me and how much of it is this software. It's like I'm kind of like, it's like driving a car. I'm not shifting the gears. Well, I'm pretty good shifting the gears. But when you drive a car, you're not doing a damn thing. The car's doing everything for you. I feel the same thing here. It's not as hands-on as taking a picture and burning and dodging and all the traditional things. But after all this rambling, my question is, I'm working in Adobe Firefly and I'm using my photograph, my original art, as the origin data. And I'm putting in prompts. It could be song lyrics. It could be just whatever it might be. And I'm producing this new image. And every time I hit generate, I get 4 new choices of here's what we came up with. How much of that image is truly mine as far as from the original data that I fed in from the original image that I said, here's what I want you to use? And how much of that is software or other people's data?
It's 38% yours. No, I'm joking. It's impossible. It's impossible to say how much is yours and how much is somebody else's. So the way these AI systems work is they train literally on millions of photos, annotated photos. So there's a picture that has an elephant in it. There's a little metadata that says elephant, and so the systems can learn to recognize what's in photos and to recognize the patterns that will make a cat in profile, a cat with one leg missing, a cat that's blinking, a cat that has a sock in its mouth. It still recognizes that it's a cat. There's a huge amount of processing that goes on to extract that information from all these millions of photos. And when you're adding a prompt to sort of create a variation of your own photo, it's still drawing on that huge amount of data that it's pulled together from its understanding of, what's going on in all those millions of photos. So even though you're starting with your photo, as soon as you put that prompt in there, it's being informed by hundreds, thousands, millions of other photos. And so it is a joint effort at that point.
It's a community gene pool. Would that be a good way of putting it?
Maybe it's sort of a consensus reality. Is that the term?
We have to coin something here today in copyright. We can make money on this. Let's do something. Okay, go ahead.
So the bottom line is you can't just draw sort of a line between how much of that was yours and how much of that is created by the AI. And I would add the prompt. How much of the prompt is your creativity? I've seen a lot of prompts that are flat and boring and dull and produce bad results. And then I've seen people who are really good at, it's called prompt engineering, the people who have skill. It's not just a matter of typing what you want. There's a skill to typing what you want in the prompt. And, that actually produces better results. And so I think that it's a collaborative effort, really. You can't say it's all you. You can't say it's all the AI. It really is both feeding into a final output.
Yeah, and by the way, I think that's also an important thing that you mentioned about the prompts themselves. If you feed in the prompt from the operating manual from a Skillman table saw, it's going to give you one kind of image. But if you put in poetry or really good writing with some really descriptive prose, you're going to get a different kind of picture, even if the subject's the same. So a lot of that has to do with what are you putting into that whole thing?
Yeah, and I don't think we're done with prompt engineering. There's going to be a lot that, first of all, that people figure out as they learn this and as they get more experience. There's also going to be better tools. OpenAI really exaggerates your prompts to get more exciting results. Adobe Firefly makes suggestions for more elaborate prompts. And now there's, an exclusion feature. So you want cat pictures without dogs, you can say exclude things with dogs, or, whatever. You can pull things out. So I think the prompt technology and the prompt tools and our own prompt skill and experience, that's all going to develop over the next few years.
Yeah, that part is the hardest part because literally it's a blank slate. It's anything. And so the current zeitgeist of whatever culture you happen to be living in is going to affect your style of prompts. I was sort of speculating on why a lot of these early pictures looked fantastical, and that was because of the zeitgeist, I believe, of like the user base. We're just interested in fantasy and kind of video game type images. But I think that if you took this technology to different cultures, which I don't know if I've seen happen yet, and let it run free, for instance, in the Maori peoples of New Zealand or other Aboriginal cultures of Australia, the resulting images would seem quite different from what we're doing here in the United States.
Well, 2 points. First is, well, that depends on the training data. And if all the photos you got are from, US and European folks who contributed pictures to Adobe stock, well, then you're going to get that kind of output. That's the bias of the training data. But the other point is, and I think this is kind of a broader point, and something I had not appreciated initially, is just how much creativity and kind of novelty this can inject into the digital imagery universe. And you said you get hooked on it, and you love to just sort of fool around with it. I've been super impressed with that too. It's fun to play with and just to create fanciful images, things that are not true, ballerinas underwater dancing with octopuses or whatever, something that's impossible. And it can just be fun. And I think that all the people who are worried about deep fakes and manipulating our elections, I'm not discounting that. But I do think that you also have to look at just the fun people are having with it, and the sort of the delight when you get an image that's just kind of fun and interesting and entertaining. It's just cool. And I think for creative people who are used to expressing themselves with illustrations or photography or something, it's a rush. You can just create all this funky new stuff. And I think that you gotta factor that into your overall assessment of this AI that's got all kinds of possible problems with trust and deep fakes and election manipulation, but it's also just a blast.
Also, be prepared to get bashed by people if you're posting a lot of these pictures on, say, Facebook and especially Instagram. I started playing around. I founded the Gotham Camera Company, and I've been playing around. I've been designing like steampunk and gothic cameras and stuff like that. But using all of my own photographs for the textures. And I have a lot of stuff of old classic wooden boats. There's a lot of brass and wood and leather. So these things, there's some funny looking cameras. And I've been posting these on the little groups that have like camera collectors and, and these are like really serious, hardcore people. And I would say that 70% of them give a thumbs up, a giggle, they love it, they get a chuckle. And the rest of them, I had one guy call me Satan. Okay, he came down on me. It was like, yeah, tell him it's fake. There's enough good stuff here. Why are we putting? And I said, guys, lighten up. It's a giggle. It's fake. It says it's not real. And then some guy said that, that AI it's bad for humanity. And I said, okay, I agree with you here, but keep one thing in mind. How many young teenage girls have harmed themselves because they're looking at magazine covers of girls their age who look, quote unquote, better, slimmer, sexier, more beautiful than I do. And they're looking at a fake picture that has been airbrushed, photoshopped, call it what you want. But anybody you see in a magazine is not real. But people don't get that. And people are already hurting themselves in Photoshop. Is this going to be the same thing? It could be even worse. But let's not say the photography is pure and harmless, because you dig deep enough, boy. You don't have to go too far. You can come up with good examples here too.
So I got a thought here, which is that, yes, you're right. Photo manipulation has been going on for ages. Every magazine cover has been airbrushed since the days of film. And you're right. And it certainly is a risk, body image problems. What's changing is that it gets easier. So it's not just the magazine cover, it's the photo you see of your classmates from high school on Instagram. So because it no longer requires a professional retoucher or somebody who can afford to buy Photoshop and learn how to use, unsharp mask, this, that, and the other thing. So it's easier for more people to do it. And that's what's changing. But the other thing I think you got to throw into the mix here is that you got to be really careful with social media. I think that it's the most dangerous vector for stuff that you can't trust or shouldn't trust or that could be harmful. But what you got to factor in is when people already have a human connection, when it's somebody in the real world, then there's sort of a contract, a social contract between you two that you have to be able to trust each other to a certain degree. So if you say, I'm going to meet you at the coffee shop, you can kind of expect that's going to be true. And if you blow off the coffee shop appointment, there are consequences. So it's kind of the same thing sharing photos. You got to think, how much manipulation am I going to be putting into this, because ultimately, if you're presenting this as true to your friends, then your friends are going to judge you accordingly, and vice versa if they present something to you that's true. So if it's somebody you know, there's a kind of a social contract in place, it kind of anchors things a little bit. I don't think that means that every photo you see of somebody you know on Instagram is necessarily going to be pure and true and completely true representation. People are still going to do a little fiddling, but there's still an anchor there. But people you don't know on social media, there's no social contract. There's a huge incentive to get attention, to pump up the colors, to make people look sexy. And that's where I think we just, as a society, have to build in some expectation that there's a high likelihood that this is only sort of kind of true. I think the ugly truth is it's very easy to manipulate people with photos and with videos. And we're just going to have to kind of internalize that a lot of these photos that you see of people you don't know from people you don't know just might not be true.
Yep.
Yep.
Excellent points. All right. We are going to take a short break, and we come back more with Stephen Shankland and AI and the state of imaging today. Stay tuned.
With the Lumix camera series, Panasonic is dedicated to achieving the highest possible image quality, resulting in compositions that faithfully reflect the photographer's intent. Panasonic strives to enable every photographer and videographer to realize their vision by creating cameras that break new ground in ergonomics, focus, and performance. Panasonic's G-Series and S-Series cameras, popular with both enthusiasts and professionals, strive to be the best camera of choice for all your creative needs. Head on over to bnh.com for more information about Panasonic Lumix cameras or use the link in our podcast show notes.
Okay, we are back with Stephen Shankland. And Jill, you have a question.
Yeah, we've been talking so far about all the fun aspects of playing around with various AI generators and prompt engineering and all that. But the thing that has been bubbling up in my head is not only that, but also the future potential career opportunities that may come out of some of these new technologies and educational programs in prompt engineering and all of that. Stephen, do you have any experience or knowledge in what might be going on there?
Well, just from what I've seen in the industry, prompt engineering is an important skill. I think it's going to be something that's internalized. A lot of people just sort of learn it, like the art of writing a good subject line in an email. We started figuring out 30 years ago. It's going to be something like that, where it's sort of basic digital literacy. And some people are going to be better at it than others. And some people are probably going to be professionals, or it's going to be part of their job. So if you're in one of those situations, if you're in a sort of a creative field at working, I don't know, an ad agency or something like that, maybe it's going to be really beneficial and valuable. If you can get good, exciting, interesting, attention-getting AI-generated images, then that's going to be a skill for somebody who's trying to come up with storyboards for a video, or somebody who's trying to come up with ideas for an ad campaign, or something that might be compelling on TikTok. So I think that it's a real skill. There's a reason they call it prompt engineering, right? You have to put some thought into it, and there are kind of rules and things like that. I do think it's going to get easier for average people to get good results, but I don't expect that it's always going to be easy for everybody to get the best results. So I think that will be something that is a valuable skill. Whether you're employed purely as a prompt engineer, I'm a little skeptical about that. But I think that good prompt engineering skills as part of a bigger job will be important. So, there are lots of courses you can now jump online, or you can just search online for sample prompts to just learn from examples. There's a lot of information out there. So I think this informal and formal education will tackle this. If you're taking any kind of a course on AI at Coursera or one of these places where you can take online courses, that I think that's going to be a significant part of it.
Cool.
What you just described, as you're describing it, I'm saying to myself, yeah, but isn't there an AI application that can do this already? No, I'm being serious. You see, when is AI going to get to a point where it could write more intuitive, better prompts than we could even dream of?
First of all, you have to start somewhere. But also, I mean, that is exactly what OpenAI is doing right now. If you use Dall-E, it takes you type in a prompt and it will create several variations of it. And, it adds a whole lot of descriptive adjectives in there, and it comes up with something that's a lot more exciting than what your original prompt would have produced. So the AI is fiddling with your prompts already.
We're talking AI in terms of photography. And one of the things that's been coming to my mind is if I was going into photography as a profession today, there's a lot of people who have a lot of reason to feel threats from AI and how it's going to affect photography. And we'd like to speak about that. But I think I would be more threatened if I was an illustrator, because it seems that most of the applications I've been seeing for AI, not that you can't do hyper realistic stuff that would be useful, that would look real and have to be real, but illustration tends to be a little bit more about fantasy and flight of imagination. And AI is just perfect for that. And it even takes your photographs and turns them into illustrations. We use the term promptography, and I just call them photo illustrations that with AI influence. That's all they are. They're playing around with stuff. You take a photograph and you've exaggerated things all the way around. So again, to come back to it, I would say that career-wise, I would say photographers probably have less of a threat than illustrators because AI can illustrate anything.
I think you're right. So if you're in the business of creating things from scratch, then AI is going to do a reasonable job of that. If you're trying to document reality, which is what a lot of photography is, just varying degrees, then AI is going to help you fiddle with the image, but it's not going to create the original moment that actually happened. A performer on a stage, the people at the county fair, the bride and groom at the wedding, my trip to Uzbekistan, whatever, all that stuff. You're capturing a moment with your camera, and if you're trying to capture a moment with a camera, AI is not going to capture a moment with a camera. It's going to help you edit it, or it might distort a picture, beyond recognition, or, there are lots of issues after capture. But if you're trying to document reality, then AI comes in after the fact, not during the initial moment. But yeah, as you say, if you're creating something out of whole cloth, for example, let's say you're doing an ad and you want to have one of these sort of stock photos of two successful business people shaking hands, or two senior citizens looking healthy riding their bicycles through the park with their cardigans tied around their shoulders for some pharmaceutical ad, right? Those kinds of things, well, those might be great for AI. And so that kind of thing might take some business off of, photographers' plates. But if you're trying to actually capture a particular moment, then yeah, I think photography will still be an important skill, and AI is going to nibble around the edges, but not replace it. One of the things that happens with AI, and this has been happening not just with AI, but with computer technology in general, is something comes along and it used to be the domain of a few highly skilled experts, and then it gets democratized. Remember desktop publishing, 80s and 90s,
yeah.
right? So that used to be a lot of skill, doing paste up and waxing paper and printing stuff up, and a lot of X-Acto knife work, and that turns into a computer. And then it turns out that professionals still need to do that if you're laying out the magazine or the ad spread or something. But then it also turns out that you can do it for your birthday invitation for your kid's birthday party or something. So it kind of expands the number of people who can do it. Doesn't necessarily replace the professionals always. Their jobs might shift, but
I've said that a lot of professionals were replaced by templates when desktop publishing came along, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. There are a lot of people out there who had the software without the talent, where it used to be you had to have the talent and know how to use the tools.
Things often get more cookie cutter. It's true.
Things get more cookie cutter. That happened with WordPress for sure. But I think Stephen's right. I think you have the real high-end designers, artists, presenters, all that stuff sort of acts as a stopgap against AI encroaching too far into the real high-level professional domains. I think those jobs are relatively safe, and it democratizes the rest of that scale, the non-very high-end, who don't do it professionally currently and won't do it professionally in the future, but can do it to create, like you said, like a birthday card greeting or something for their friends. So I'm still skeptical of how many actual professional jobs get moved around here, except for what you said, stock image generator people who've already been decimated in decades
Well,
past.
so my feeling is that the professional level jobs or the professional people maybe will need to have a more unique vision, let's say, or, it seems like that is a qualifier looking back into the past for success in photography and creative industries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Stephen, when you said that right now OpenAI or Dall-E is using their chat GPT or an offshoot thereof to help you create the prompts, it's true. I mean, there's only so much a non-artist like myself. I don't consider myself an artist. My imagination just runs out of steam at a certain point because in a way, we all are operating with our own set of algorithms in our heads that are there from the societies we live in, like I said before. So there are some constraints. If you're an artist, you can break past those. But those are special people. And I'd like to know how they think, but it's not how I think. So I appreciate the help I can get with my prompts.
Well, I think probably people would look at you and see the same thing, right? I mean, I look at people who are, I'm bad at video, right? I'm amazed that people produce these videos. They take hours of footage and they cut it down to something useful and punchy and informative or whatever. That's not my skill set. It's somebody's skill set. I admire it. And, people look at skilled photographers.
Mhm.
They might not be a skilled photographer and they think, wow. So, yeah, we all have our abilities and our skills that we develop. And I do think that you're right that, if you can develop a particular style or something that helps you stand out above the crowd, then that's always going to be a good professional opportunity to get ahead in some way. There are a lot of times when being cookie cutter makes you just look like it's routine and you didn't put any effort into it or anything like that. On the other hand, there are times when you might have to suppress your aesthetic instincts. Say you're a wedding photographer or something, and your client says, I want all the photos to look like this. And they show you a certain look, and maybe it's all blue and orange or hazy, gauzy. I don't know what they want, right? But in that sort of a situation, well, maybe you have to do what they want, but maybe AI helps you do that, where you use some style transfer kind of a thing, and you can adopt the style that a client wants.
Yeah, and you don't have to waste your own time if it's something that does not fit within your personal style guide. AI can be a big help with that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about ethical considerations and intellectual property rights in relation to AI. I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that when working with AI generators, even with your own images, it's hard to quantify what percent of the image is truly yours. Do you foresee in the future copyright issues needing to be adjusted to consider AI, to bring AI uses or AI generation into the mix?
Yeah, that's going through the courts right now, actually. That's a thorny issue, and I don't think we've heard the last of it. So the U.S. Patent and Copyright Office, they said AI-generated images can't be copyrighted because they're created by machines and there's not enough human in the loop. But I could definitely see at some point there might be some, not exactly exceptions to that, but different usages of AI where maybe there is more of a human in the loop, maybe because you're blending in your own photos as a starting point, or maybe you're actually training off of your own photos, and so that modifies the AI in some way, or maybe the prompt engineering, or maybe the way you put together a lot of photos into some larger work. I can see a lot of situations where there is more human involvement, and therefore it is copyrightable, or perhaps situations where your AI image is embedded in part of a larger copyrighted work. So that's certainly one position. I don't think we have a settled answer on whether creators need to be compensated for the works that they create that feed into these, enormous databases of training data, whether that's millions of photos or just billions and billions of words off of Wikipedia and out of books and Reddit blog posts and news articles and everything else that the large language models are trained off of. I follow a lot of people and chatter in this area, and some people think, it's outrageous that somebody would, point a bot at the New York Times, slurp up all this data and help, use all that very carefully crafted information to help train an AI database. And then I talk to other people who think, well, but that's just what humans do. We look at all this information and we train our own brains. Should we, we have to pay for every little bit we consume? Is this qualitatively different? I personally do think it's qualitatively different given the scale that these AI models work at versus the scale a human works at. But I don't really think we have an easy ethical answer to that question. I was intrigued that Adobe chose not only to train off its own carefully licensed content, but also that it actually pays creators back, people who have contributed to Adobe stock. There's sort of a loose formula that gives them actual money if their photos were used in the AI Firefly image training database. And I think that's virtuous to explicitly pay creators for producing the stuff that trains the databases. But is that going to happen with a large language model or every image generation AI? I'm a little skeptical.
No, Adobe was in the unique position of having to own this like insane corpus of images, and so they did the quote virtuous thing because they could, but none of the other companies had that opportunity to begin with. I think there was something where Getty Images made a deal with one of these big companies, I'm not sure which, so that they have the license to use, but it was like a multi-million-dollar.
Getty has licensed its photos for use, and it's also sued DeviantArt and Stability AI and Midjourney. And, they were ones where you'd actually see their watermark showing up in some photos when you use the generative AI tools in the earlier days. So
you'd see the Getty watermark show up?
Well, Getty Images.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
That was pretty egregious, but but it's also, I think, interestingly, a failure of the AI system. So it's a situation where the AI was, spotting patterns that were there, but that you would not actually want to get in a result. So that's a situation where fixing the AI so it works better would get that level of visibility down, but the base concern of using images for training data would not go away.
Mike, you had a question about authentication on imagery, I believe.
So yeah, the idea of in-camera authentication has been now implemented in, I think, Leica and Sony cameras. But what's interesting is that in just doing a very quick Google search a couple hours ago, I found a conversation on a photo blog site from 2011 asking the same question. Can images be authenticated in cameras? And there was like a bunch of scientists that were involved in that conversation, researchers, who said that yes, they can actually look at the data in a raw file and see where the file has been sort of manipulated and adulterated, and they can sort of peg that to a manipulated attempt. But now we have these other regimes from Leica and Sony. Those are useful, I think, in photojournalism for sure, for cases where the validity and authenticity of the images are going to make a big difference, such as in a courtroom, for instance. And I'm sure we're going to see this stuff proliferate throughout camera manufacturers. Do you think that will be the case for cell phones, for instance?
So yeah, what you're referring to, it's a technology called content credentials, and there's an outfit that actually began at Adobe, Content Authenticity Initiative, CAI, and it's produced standards that anybody can adopt. It's pretty interesting technology. So what it does is it takes a hash of the initial photo, which basically means sort of a digital fingerprint of the original image. And then as you go through and you edit it with Photoshop and then you publish it at the BBC, then maybe recompress it and then publish it. As each of these steps goes through, these organizations that participate in this effort, it adds a little bit extra information, and so you can kind of follow the provenance of the photo. It came from a Sony camera, got edited by Photoshop, and then got compressed by such and such. And then if you're in a situation where you want to test the trust, you can run it through a system that basically gives you some assurance that this photo went through sort of a chain of custody. So basically what it does is it offers people who want to show that you can trust a photo a way that you can find out whether you can trust that photo. Now, it doesn't do everything. I was initially more skeptical about this effort because I was thinking of the deepfakes case or situations where people are deliberately trying to fool you, and it doesn't fix that problem. But what it does do is it gives good actors an opportunity to offer trust that you can then check. And that is a pretty important use case. So as you say, I think photojournalism is the most likely situation where that first arrives. And indeed, there are lots of big players there, including the Associated Press and the BBC. And there are lots of software people involved, most notably Adobe. And there are some camera people involved. Nikon is also in there, although they haven't released any cameras that support it yet. So I think we will see that technology spread. I think two things that are interesting about that is that OpenAI, which does the Dall-E generative AI, they announced that they're going to adopt it a few days ago. And then today, actually, Google has also announced that it's contributing to the standard, and it looks likely that they are going to use it as well, which is interesting. They had a different approach when they announced that they were going to try to offer some transparency with generative AI images when they announced that last year. And I said, well, why not use the content credentials technology? And they didn't ever give me a straight answer, but they decided to go that direction. And so that's announced today. So I think we're going to see that technology mature and be easier to use. You might be seeing it popping up a little CR icon in the corner of a photo when you look on Facebook, something like that. I think we're going to see browser extensions that might run the checks automatically. So I think that will get easier to use and more useful. I'm not convinced it's going to really solve the problem, but I think it could help offer trust where people want to show that something is trustworthy. So it's not going to always be useful.
Right.
Whether it actually shows up in smartphones is a really good question. It adds extra data, increases the file size a little bit. It adds a processing burden because you have to take a hash. You have to process the photo a little bit. So I'm a little more skeptical about that. It certainly could happen at some point. That's certainly what the content credentials folks want to happen. Whether that actually does happen, I don't know, but I do think that it's useful to have a foothold of trust for those who need to be able to show it, even if it doesn't solve the whole problem.
Well, the best assurance we have right now are raw files.
Yeah.
A raw file is admissible as evidence in a court of law because you can't change a raw file. There's a little bit of an iffiness about that, but for the longest time, that was the case.
Even in this article from 2011, there was links to a couple of different white hacker sites that had hacked into Nikon and Canon's raw encryption stuff. And so they were able to finagle the raw data from those cameras. I think this digital hash provenance tracking idea makes a lot of sense to me, at least for the good actors who need to prove that the stuff hasn't been manipulated. Like you said, it doesn't address the generative deepfake stuff.
I think you have to look at one point here, which is that you're never going to get something that's perfect. With sufficient skill and money, you're going to be able to crack or break or fake anything. But if the obstacles get high enough, it will in effect deter malfeasance. So even if a solution isn't perfect, I think, especially if it's done in combination with 16 other things and a certain amount of social norms and expectations over here, and something in class when you're in 5th grade over there, and a news story you read about warning of this over here, and content credentials over there, you pile all these things on top of each other, and you get maybe not a perfect regime for ensuring when you can trust photos, but you get a good enough system where it's just hard enough to do it, and people are just prepped enough that that they should be on the alert for fakery, that you actually get a system where you don't completely lose all trust in photos. And I don't think any of us wants that to happen. Still, I see people taking more photos than ever when they're at concerts and when they're at a restaurant and when they're walking around town and sharing those photos with their friends and their family. I don't see that going away. So fundamentally, people are still going to trust photos, at least in those situations where they're dealing with their family and friends and there's that extra social contract. I don't see photography dying because of this trust problem. There are just too many of us taking photos that we actually care about, sharing them with people whom we care about. So I don't think it's going to disappear.
About a week after we recorded everything you've been listening to up till now, a new text-to-video application called Sora was introduced by OpenAI. Sora is a text-to-video application that creates extremely realistic videos up to 1 minute long. You don't need a film crew. Heck, you don't even need a camera, let alone makeup or wardrobe crews. You can still rent a catering truck, but a box of donuts says you're going to have a harder time justifying this film-era perk in your expense reports once the bean counters catch wind of all this. So in the interest of keeping you, our listeners, as up-to-date as possible, we got Stephen back on mic to ask him about this new kid on the block. Stephen, a box of donuts also says you undoubtedly have thoughts about Sora. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I got to say, so a lot of these AI technologies, I come into it, well, should my glass be half empty or should my glass be half full? Because they undoubtedly have a lot of, impressive abilities, but they also have a lot of shortcomings. So when I first saw the Sora output, the videos it could produce, I was definitely on the half full side. I was wowed. I thought, it's pretty spectacular. And it really reminded me of when I first started seeing the first text to image generator results arriving from OpenAI's Dall-E and other tools like that. So at first I was really wowed, but it turns out that the exact same problems that plague the text to image generation tools, you see it all over again with the text to video stuff. So you see problems with people's heels not connecting with the ground quite correctly, or puppies spawning into two puppies and then one disappears, or there's some mastodons walking along and, oh, that one's only got 3 legs. Oh, nope, now it's got 4 legs. So it's got all these weird little hallucination things.
So it's still turning animals into Maine Coon cats, essentially.
It doesn't do like radical transformations, but it's clear, it's got some idea of, essence of cat, and sometimes you see 3 legs of a cat and sometimes you see 4 legs of a cat. And it has that same kind of problem that all the other AI has. So if you're looking at things closely, then you're going to see problems. But for a lot of types of videos, like I was particularly impressed with the sort of simulated drone videos. They had one going over, Lago di Garda or something in Italy, or another one over the Big Sur, California coast with waves crashing against the rocks. And if you hadn't told me those were fake, I wouldn't have thought they were fake. And ones with people, especially hands, there's something about AI and fingers. It just bungles it all the time. So things like that are still really tricky. Whenever you have 2 entities in one of these AI generated scenes, video or still imagery, and these 2 entities are connecting in some way, like 2 people holding hands or a cat jumping onto somebody's lap or something like that, the AI has really a hard time with the interface when those 2 entities connect. So that problem still persists. So that's kind of my half-empty take on it. But like I say, it's super impressive. And I think there are going to be some applications where it's already perfectly good. So if you need some stock video footage of some scenic coastline or a beautiful forest, some of the imagery it had of like birds sitting on a tree branch, exotic tropical birds, were super convincing. So that I think there are going to be a lot of situations where this is going to be useful already. Now, it's not going to wipe out your movie crew. Anything that you have to have real humans in, you're going to want to be careful with this kind of technology. But this is the first version. This is not the last version. Expect improvement.
It's really knocks you out. The video that they put out there was that Asian woman walking down, looked like a Times Square kind of street at night in the rain. They described all of it. And what you're watching is what they described. Now, little things that I noticed is that if there was movement, all the movement was at the same tempo and speed. In other words, she's walking at a set speed. Everybody in the background is also walking at that same casual speed. I didn't see one delivery guy on a bike go shooting by with bags of takeout. I'm waiting for that. Another thing I noticed is that there was one part where they go in close. It was a head and shoulder tight shot of her, and she's moving around, looking around. And while the movements are extremely realistic, the way she moves, it kind of reminds me of the way I feel when I didn't sleep well and I got a crick in my neck. There's like a very, very like a slow. It's not a natural flow. It's too smooth. I find it's not erratic like we move.
Yeah, there are a lot of those problems in these videos, and most of them were all sort of slow motion for reasons not exactly clear to me, including that one of the woman walking through that Japanese rainy urban landscape. Also with that one, some of the people in the background kind of looked like they were slithering along, and her
Yeah.
feet didn't quite connect. But on the other hand, it got the reflections right. It got the ambiance right. It got the
Yes.
the vibe right. It really felt like a wet neon landscape at night in Tokyo or something like that. So it's very impressive, but it's certainly not perfect. I guess one of the things that really impresses me is how their AI model internalizes a lot of physics. And that's really hard to do. So it gets light reflections correct. It gets shadows correct. It sort of seems to understand a lot about how skeletons work. And this is stuff that it doesn't need to be taught exactly. The way these AI models work is you feed a huge amount of training data into it, and it sort of learns to recognize patterns and behavior and reproduce it. And so I was impressed with how much it was able to reproduce, but it doesn't understand reality. It's got video of a dragon flying, and it was flying backwards. It does not understand the direction that dragons fly. So, on the one hand, neat, it can create a flying dragon out of just its own bits and bytes. But on the other hand, it doesn't understand the real world the way humans do.
I think there's definitely some physics stuff. I think there's like just cause and effect understandings that it's going to have to work on and improve. I was just blown away at the richness of the videos from the limited text. We're getting like a sentence, maybe two sentences. And out of that comes this just incredibly rich, vibrant video. The other thing that I really wanted to stress is that a lot of the points that we talked about earlier regarding stills and regarding this idea of having a social contract with real people, with documenting the real world, doesn't apply necessarily to narrative video. I suspend my disbelief. Everyone does to make a movie work. And that element of not needing to have a movie set on planet Earth with people that I know really sort of decouples some of those guardrails, I think, that prohibit a lot of AI-generated still photography from making inroads into photography. This stuff is operating on a different narrative level.
My 2 cents on this is that my neighbor is a producer of independent films and documentaries. And he was talking about this just the other day with me, and he's really upset about this stuff. He just knows how this is going to be exploited, in the film industry and things like that. And he's truly concerned about it. I mean, I think still imaging, dealing with prompts, raised a lot of eyebrows. This takes it to a whole other level.
I think it's going to be a while before Hollywood gets blown out of the water by this. I think there are a huge number of challenges getting this from where it is today to getting it where you perhaps might want it to be eventually. So, for example, maybe like that scene with the woman walking through Tokyo in the rain, and that's cool and stuff, but you want to tweak it a little bit. Well, you can't exactly. It's not like you're sitting there with a bunch of 3D models or some nonlinear editing software like Adobe Premiere or whatever, where you want to go and tweak things a little bit, change the camera angle, change the lighting or something. You got to do a whole new regenerate, and then it's going to have a completely different character and a completely different scene. So if you want control over what the output is, just clicking the generate again button is not control. It might get something that's closer to what you want or farther from what you want. You tweak the prompt a little bit, but this is not something that is going to be able to produce a full-length commercial of any sophistication, much less the feature-length movie. But there are a lot of situations, one little scene here or there, stock videos, stock footage, the airplane landing at LAX or something like that. That's the kind of thing where it's kind of generic stuff. There's a ton of training data out there that it can learn from that, you might swap in a scene. That's not the highest end part of what the filmmaking industry does by any stretch of the imagination. But, somebody gets paid for it. It might be a stock video agency. It might be somebody goes out and does this.
Drone operators are going to feel the heat from this. People that make their living at that. Well, from what I've read, it takes about 60 minutes to render 60 seconds. So that's much longer, for instance, than the stuff we saw for the stills.
I remember when it took 1 hour to download 1 gig of data from a drive when you're shooting digital. So that's temporary. That's a hiccup.
Yeah, could be. I mean, there's a company that's creating new custom chips to improve the rendering speed.
There are many companies working on custom chips to improve AI, to accelerate it. And that's a huge business out here in Silicon Valley where I'm based. And I expect that there are going to be a lot of challenges there that go along with the improvements, because as soon as some new horsepower arrives, somebody at Meta or Google at OpenAI or some startup or wherever is going to uncork that horsepower, and they're going to say, well, now we're going to do something. Now we're going to do 120 seconds instead of 60 seconds, or we're going to do a higher resolution, or we're going to add sound in there, or we're going to increase the size of the training data set. They have an infinite appetite right now for computer horsepower. Every year that goes by, these AI models get more efficient. There's a lot of work to, get more bang for the buck.
I think NVIDIA is like the most valuable company in the world. It actually eclipsed Apple a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, they're the prime seller of the of AI acceleration chips, and they're cashing in. But there's a huge demand for these processors.
A couple of things came to my mind. Aside from being blown away by the videos, as the rest of the world was, I thought of a couple of things. One was the duration and the timing of the Writers Guild of America and the SAG-AFTRA strike last year. That sort of flagged in my mind as curious and relevant and connected to this technology. The other thing was the types of videos that OpenAI put on display. I mean, some of them were animations and just cartoons, but they did have a lot of live action stuff with physical people, with human beings. And that would sort of imply that there may be at some point a editing software based component to this, so that once you render 60 seconds of video, you can go in and tweak afterwards without re-rendering the entire thing.
I do think that's going to happen. I do think you're going to be able to insert a specific character into a video, or start with a still photo and then use that sort of as a foundation for the video that it spawns off of that as a starting point. So those are refinements that are going to be complicated, but I do expect we'll see more of that.
And really the speed, OpenAI released Dall-E, I think it was not this past summer, but the summer before. And now we have this, which is not arbitrarily easy to do. There's physics involved, there's camera movements involved. And I mean, it's pretty breathtaking, from seeing a still image from text to a fully involved scene with lots of individual photorealistic, non-people, generated. It really did take my breath away.
One little factor I find with the still images as well is there is a fun factor here. There are a lot of people like me who are not going to be able to go out and do a detailed oil painting of something cool, but it's kind of fun to fool around with these tools. We haven't got a chance to fool around with Sora yet. I'm not sure when that's going to happen exactly, but there's an element of creativity and fun here that I don't think you want to discount. There's a reason these new generation of generative AI tools got so many people excited. It really is intellectually stimulating in a lot of ways. It's fun to explore this new space. So it's got all kinds of risks and challenges, but it's also, this new sort of engine of creativity that I think a lot of people appreciate.
It's a creative slot machine in a sense. You drop your quarters in and you pull a slot, and every time you do that, 4 new things come up, and every once in a while you hit a winner.
Yeah.
And will it democratize the creative class, allowing individual people more access to tools to,
more access to an entire film crew.
Right.
Stephen, I appreciated that sentiment from earlier in this conversation. And I appreciate the sentiment now that you really shouldn't discount that this can be just, trivially fun.
It's another version of Instagram filters in a certain sense. But seriously, there's a novelty to it. All right. There's a limit at this point with some of the basic programs of how much we can say that we are being creative when we do this, because it's so random. And again, we input the prompts, we input the original photographs if we're going that route. But at the end of the day, it's like there's all this stuff buzzing around in the box that's deciding what the outcome is going to be. It's like a loose steering wheel in a car. You can kind of aim where you're going, but if that wheel ain't tight, you don't know where you're ending up.
Right. One of the most interesting things was the disparity between the generalization of the prompts to the specificity of the output video was quite staggering. And I'm sure once this is open, even as a beta, we're going to get a lot more dials to tweak. This was OpenAI's presentation. We have no idea what's happening. They're saying this is what we use to do the prompts, but we don't really know exactly any of the stuff.
Well, it's the same thing when you had those giant billboards all over town saying shot on iPhone. They had these magnificent images that you can only dream of taking. Yes, it was done with an iPhone, but if you ever saw the way they ripped that thing apart and hacked it and built all kinds of other things into it, there was an iPhone in the system that took that picture.
Right.
But there's no way any of us are going to be catching that very same picture with our, out-of-the-box iPhone or any other smartphone. We mentioned on more than a few occasions here how this can be a threat to people in the film industry, and still imaging could also be threatened, still photographers. And no doubt this is going to be a factor in the development of the industry, especially if you're trying to earn a living at it. But my feeling is that the first people who are going to be feeling this, and people will be feeling it probably stronger and sooner, are illustrators and animators.
Yeah.
Because still photography, it's going to take a little while longer before we're going to look at one of these images right out of the box and say, wow, I can't tell the difference. There actually are 5 fingers on that properly formed hand. Whereas illustrators take liberties with what quote unquote reality looks like. And that's part of what the charm of illustration is. It exaggerates the world as we see it. And same thing with animation. It teases us the way regular film and video doesn't. That's more real. So I would say that animators are going to be jumping all over this and using it as a true tool that is not as uncomfortable. Same thing with illustrators, whereas photographers and traditional filmmakers, that's going to be a tougher nut to crack.
There's a reason why Pixar started back in the days of Toy Story. It started with cartoon characters, and that's because photorealism is really hard. There's this uncanny valley problem where something is sort of real but not real, and it makes you feel kind of queasy looking at one of these obviously not true humans. It gives you the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah, right.
And if you turn things into comic book characters or clay models or paper cutouts or anything like that, then animation gets much easier. The same thing happens with AI. I much prefer the AI results when I am fooling around with various artistic styles than if I'm trying to do something that's photorealistic. That's where you notice the problems, the details much more. You can't hide in sort of broad brush strokes and cartoon characters. So yeah, there's a reason that all that stuff starts without photorealism, because when you try to be actually mirroring reality, it's a lot harder a challenge.
One of the funny things I really enjoyed on Netflix, of all the things that I've ever seen there was a show, Blacklist. And in one of their episodes, it was the last episode in 2020 when COVID hit. And they were halfway through filming the last episode of the season when they were shut down. And their solution was brilliant. They presented whatever they had already shot, and then the rest of it, they just turned into animation. And all of a sudden, your screen was like distorting, like on Twilight Zone. There's nothing wrong. And all of a sudden, you're watching a cartoon of the action with their voices and a little bits of reality. And then they would slip back into the real film, when they caught up to scenes that they had. And it was actually enjoyable and fun. They turned what could have been a total disaster into a fun adventure.
Yeah, I got to say, one of the areas where I think these kinds of tools are really good, storyboarding. I think it might not be the final product, but it might be getting you a step toward a final product, and also sort of ideation, where you're spitballing ideas around, trying to see what'll stick, what excites you, what looks interesting, what looks compelling, what kind of a look or a vibe you want. So I think there are a lot of situations there where established creative pros who are in the industry can get some productivity help out of these tools. It's not just oh, that's it. You're going to be wiped out by a data center full of NVIDIA GPUs somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think eventually, and who knows what that word means, eventually might be next year or might be 3 years, you will have one-offs, like people in their bedrooms making movies and uploading them to YouTube and bypassing both distributors and the unions that represent the working class of film production, but not right now. I think the ideation part is extremely important. Just seeing some of those videos, it's so evocative. The woman walking through the neon rain-drenched streets of Tokyo, and then a couple hours after these silent videos were released, 11 Labs came out with their text to soundscapes, which they created to accompany the video. So that was really impressive too. There's a voiceover for the sci-fi trailer astronauts in red wool,
and the woman's heels click when she walks through the rainy urban landscape. So that's an interesting technology, trying to map some sound to the videos. Most of that sound was pretty generic, but even pretty generic goes a long way if you're doing some a lot of people who are producing YouTube videos or something like that, they might benefit from even that sort of generic level of sound.
Much better than silent movies. Stephen, any idea as to when OpenAI might make this beta?
They haven't said. It looks to me that this is, if anything, more challenging than opening this up than the text-to-image technology, just because the deepfake concern is pretty high. And I think that the technology itself, it's really processor intensive. So this has got to be very expensive for them to run.
Right.
It's not going to be easy to fit into their existing free or $20 a month ChatGPT Plus plans. So I'm not expecting anything fast. They are going to be releasing more information, like the system card, which details their work to figure out what the abuse mechanisms are and what they've done to try to thwart those kinds of problems. This is something OpenAI tries to think pretty carefully about, and I think there are a lot of risks with video, just because our brains just naturally see it and process it. It's just like goes straight into our brains. It's hard to sort of exercise a lot of sort of detached intellectual analysis to a video. Sometimes you just look at it and immediately part of your brain thinks it's true.
I'll just be happy if they hold off on all of this until after the next election. That's all.
I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
Serious. I'm being very serious.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
That was actually a perfect segue.
Wow.
Miracle of AI.
Stephen Shankland, it's really funny. When we were recording earlier, we said we have to have you back on the show sometime. I did not think it was going to be on the very same show we'd have you come back. I think this is a first for us. I don't remember ever doing this before, but thank you for being available to update the show for us, because this is definitely very valuable and very relevant to what we were speaking about earlier. In the meantime, any interesting projects coming up, articles, photography projects, or anything that we should be aware of?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm all over the map. I will say that I just got the exclusive story on Adobe Lightroom on the Apple Vision Pro. That's their augmented reality, virtual reality, spatial computing headset. That was pretty interesting. I was generally favorably impressed. It actually was well-timed because I'd just done a transcontinental flight and I wanted to edit all these photos. I had like 6 hours. I was going to go through this catalog and I couldn't open my laptop lid enough that I could actually do it. And it would have been a perfect case where if I could have put those little VR goggles on, I could have been editing without having to worry about that seat in front of me. Anyway, we just published that. I got a whole lot of other things going on: drone delivery, microprocessor manufacturing. I got a little tidbit in the photo world about a Lightroom competitor coming up that's going to be pretty interesting. Probably write about that in the next few days. And cool. So I always have too many interesting projects going on to write about, but I do have a particular soft spot for digital photography, so I'm glad we had the chance to talk.
That's great. And if our listeners want to catch up on more of your work, what sites should they go to?
Oh, golly. Well, I publish at CNET. The easiest way to find me, though, is If you go to twitter.com/stshank, STSHANK, get a link to everything I write, I publish there, and also the other social media accounts where I'm generally more active. But that's probably the easiest place to find me.
All right. Well, we'll pop that into our show notes as well, so our listeners can, in fact, catch up and follow what you're up to. Great talking with you. We were all really looking forward to this because, again, it's a hot topic, and everybody has questions, and every time you get an answer, it gives you 3 more questions.
Happy to be on the show. It's fascinating material, and probably better wrap it up now. Otherwise, we're going to have to sign on again next week for the next new headline.
Actually, I just got an update. There is a new Let's quit while we're ahead. If you're a fan of the show but not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests and show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Allan White. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Our executive producer is Bjorn Peterson, and our editorial director is Sean Steiner. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Panasonic for sponsoring this week's episode.